Why did everyone assume she didn't belong? That's the question no one asked. Not out loud, anyway. They just knew. The way you know rain is coming before the first drop falls. The way you feel danger before you see it. Instinct. That's what Sergeant Mark Hale called it. Not cruelty, not judgment, just instinct. The kind you earn after years of breathing desert heat, after bad intel gets good men killed, after you've watched decisions made in air-conditioned rooms thousands of miles away turn into body bags in places with unpronounceable names. Forward Operating Base Orion squatted on the edge of southern Afghanistan like a wound that refused to heal. Blast walls ringed the perimeter. Dust storms never quite settled. At midday, the temperature pushed past 110 degrees, hot enough to warp metal and patience alike. This wasn't a place for passengers. Everyone here carried weight. Everyone earned space. Everyone except her. She stood just inside the command tent, boots clean, uniform standard issue. No custom stitching. No lucky talisman hanging from her gear. No rifle slung with that casual familiarity that marked real operators. Just a tablet clutched to her chest. Eyes that moved too carefully, like she was measuring the room instead of trying to conquer it. Hale didn't bother to hide his irritation. "Who's this?" he asked, not looking up from the sand table. Maps, satellite photos, the architecture of violence spread out before him like a puzzle missing pieces. "Intelligence liaison," the captain replied, already distracted. "From Washington." The words soured the air instantly. The men around the table exchanged looks, tight smiles, raised brows, the silent language of people who knew exactly what that meant. Another observer, another note-taker, another careerist sent to watch them work and file reports that would never smell like cordite or blood. She stepped forward anyway, introduced herself. Evelyn Cross, analyst. Her voice was calm, not timid, not defensive, just controlled, like she'd practiced this moment, like she knew what was coming. Hale finally looked at her, 30-something maybe. Hard to tell with the sun bleaching everything down to essentials. No visible scars, no edge. The kind of face you expected to see under fluorescent lights, not canvas and heat. He nodded once, sharp, dismissive. Find a spot and stay out of the way. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The words landed like a boundary drawn in stone. But here's what no one noticed. The way her jaw tightened, just for a second, just enough, like she'd swallowed something bitter and kept walking. Hale's team had been together for nearly 2 years, long enough to finish each other's sentences, long enough to trust each other with their lives without hesitation. A sniper who could count heartbeats between breaths, a medic who had stitched wounds under fire without shaking, a comm specialist who could coax a signal out of static and prayer. They had survived Kandahar, Helmand, and one extraction gone so wrong it still lived in the silence between them. They didn't need someone from headquarters slowing them down. The briefing continued without her. The target was a compound nestled against the foothills west of Kandahar. Mud walls, solar panels, a communications mast that looked civilian if you didn't know where to look. High Command wanted eyes on it. Possible coordination hub. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. As Hale outlined the approach route, Evelyn Cross sat quietly at the back, fingers moving across her tablet, absorbing details without interrupting. But her eyes kept drifting to the satellite imagery, zooming and panning where no one else was looking. She saw things the others didn't linger on. A dirt road with tire tracks too regular for local traffic. A generator pattern that suggested redundancy. The mast's shadow falling at an angle that didn't match civilian use. Drones had flown overhead and reported nothing unusual. But drones only saw what they were told to look for. Halfway through the briefing, she spoke. "Sergeant," she said carefully, "the Southwest Ridge thermal scans show consistent movement every 90 minutes. That suggests a counter-surveillance loop. The eastern approach offers better cover and fewer heat signatures." The tent went quiet, not because she was wrong, but because she had spoken. Hale turned slowly, his expression flat and unreadable. Analysts don't run operations, he said. They support them from a distance. A few of the men smirked. One muttered something about librarians and gunfights. Evelyn nodded once and said nothing more. She made a note on her tablet and folded back into herself as if the moment had never happened. But her jaw tightened just enough to notice if you were looking for it. The briefing ended. Gear checks were called, wheels up in 6 hours. As the team filed out, the sun dipped lower, painting the base in copper and shadow. Dust kicked up by passing vehicles hung in the air like smoke that never cleared. Evelyn Cross remained seated long after the tent emptied, studying the imagery again with a focus that bordered on intensity. Something about the compound didn't fit. Later that evening, she sat outside the barracks, the blue glow of her tablet stark against the darkening sky. The mountains in the distance looked peaceful from here, which was how they fooled people. Violence didn't announce itself. It settled in quietly and waited. A shadow fell across her screen. "You going to burn your eyes out with that thing?" a voice asked. She looked up to see the team's communications specialist holding 2 metal cups. Coffee. Real coffee, not the powdered lie most people suffered throughout here. "Thanks," she said, taking one. "Didn't think anyone noticed." He shrugged. "Hard not to, you see more than you say." She smiled faintly. "Occupational hazard." He hesitated, then added, "Don't take Hale personally. Bad intel cost him people once. Trust doesn't come easy after that." "I'm not here to be trusted," Evelyn replied. "I'm here to do my job." That answer seemed to satisfy him. He left her to the quiet. Minutes later, her tablet chimed once, softly, an encrypted message. She glanced around, then entered a response code so complex it would have looked like noise to anyone else. When she finished, she wiped the exchange clean. For a brief moment, the mask slipped. Her shoulders squared. Her gaze hardened. Whatever she was waiting for, it wasn't approval. When the team moved out under cover of darkness, Evelyn Cross kept pace easily despite the rough terrain. She didn't complain. She didn't ask questions. Still, Hale positioned her in the center of the formation, protected, contained, minimized, exactly where he wanted her. What he didn't know, what no one there knew, was that while they believed they were walking into a routine reconnaissance mission, something else was already in motion. Signals were being counted. Timers were running. Decisions had been made far above their pay grade. And the woman he'd told to stay out of the way was the reason they were all there. The desert doesn't announce the moment before everything goes wrong. It just waits. What was she seeing that they weren't? By the time the team reached the outer ridgeline, Evelyn Cross already knew the mission had gone sideways. She felt it in the rhythm of the ground beneath her boots, the way the gravel shifted where it shouldn't, the way the wind carried sound too cleanly from the valley below. Experience didn't always come from carrying a rifle. Sometimes it came from years of watching patterns until deviations screamed louder than gunfire. Sergeant Mark Hale crouched at the crest, raising his optics toward the compound. From his angle, it looked exactly like what command had briefed. Quiet, dim, almost asleep, a handful of heat blooms, nothing alarming. He felt the familiar comfort of confirmation. The plan was working. Below them, the compound sat like a half-forgotten thought at the edge of the world. Mud walls, a central courtyard, a communications mast blinking red at steady intervals. Too steady, Evelyn thought. Civilian infrastructure was sloppy by nature. This wasn't. She tapped her tablet, pulling up a layered overlay she'd been building since they left the wire. Satellite passes, drone feeds, signal drift. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed a picture that made her pulse quicken. The compound wasn't just active, it was coordinated, disciplined, military. She moved forward carefully, keeping her voice low. "Sergeant, the signal pattern shifted. This isn't a relay station, it's a command node." Hale didn't look at her. Intel said otherwise. "Intel's wrong." Now he turned. The irritation was back, sharper this time. "You've been here 2 days, I've been doing this for 8 years. We go with the plan." Evelyn held his gaze. For a moment something unspoken passed between them. Not defiance, not submission, just a truth she couldn't voice yet. "Understood," she said quietly. But she didn't close her tablet. She kept watching, kept calculating. The team descended into the valley in pairs, moving like shadows through terrain that offered little cover. The moonless night worked in their favor, but it also meant trusting instincts over sight. Every step was deliberate, every breath measured. Evelyn stayed in formation, her rifle now visible, held with a competence that surprised the man ahead of her. She moved well, too well for someone who supposedly spent her days behind a desk. They reached the outer wall without incident. Hale signaled for the breach team to move up. Charges were set. Timers synced. On his mark, the night would crack open, and they'd pour through like water finding cracks. But Evelyn was staring at her tablet again. Her face had gone pale. "Sergeant," she whispered urgently, "we need to abort." Hale's hand froze mid-signal. "What?" The thermal bloom just spiked. "There are at least 30 combatants inside. This isn't reconnaissance. It's a trap." "Negative," Hale said, his voice hard. "We've already committed." "You committed to bad intelligence. I'm telling you to pull back." For the first time, real anger flashed in his eyes. "You don't give orders here." Evelyn's jaw set. She looked like she wanted to say something, something that would change everything. But instead she just nodded, stepped back, let him make the call. The charges blew. The wall came down in a shower of dust and stone. The team moved in fast, weapons up, clearing corners with practiced efficiency. For the first 30 seconds, it went exactly as planned. Then the world exploded. Gunfire erupted from every direction, not sporadic, not panicked, coordinated, precise. Muzzle flashes lit up windows that weren't supposed to be occupied. Rounds punched through the courtyard, kicking up dirt in lethal patterns. "Contact!" someone screamed. The team scattered, diving for cover behind crumbling walls and rusted vehicles. Return fire cracked out in disciplined bursts, but they were outnumbered and outflanked. This wasn't a compound. It was a kill box. Hale's mind raced. How had they missed this? How had every piece of intelligence been this wrong? He glanced back and saw Evelyn Cross crouched behind a low wall, her face grim but unsurprised. Like she'd seen this coming. Like she'd tried to warn him. "Fall back," Hale roared. "Fighting retreat, move." But retreat meant crossing open ground under fire. It meant leaving wounded behind. It meant admitting the mission was blown. Then something shifted. Evelyn wasn't retreating. She was moving forward. Low, fast, purposeful. "Cross, what the hell are you doing?" Hale shouted. She didn't answer. She was already halfway to the central building, using cover like she'd memorized the layout in her sleep. Her movements weren't those of an analyst trying to survive. They were those of someone executing a plan. A plan no one else knew about. Hale felt something cold settle in his chest, a realization he didn't want to face. This mission had never been what he thought it was, and the woman he'd dismissed, the liability he'd tried to minimize, was about to prove that in the worst possible way. The firefight intensified. Rounds hammered their position. An RPG streaked overhead and detonated against the outer wall, showering them with debris. The medic was already working on a wounded soldier, hands slick with blood, voice steady despite the chaos. And through it all, Evelyn Cross kept moving, deeper into the compound, toward something only she knew was there. Hale made a decision. "Cover her," he snapped at the nearest operator. "Sir, she's—" "I said cover her." The operator didn't argue. He shifted position and laid down, suppressing fire, carving a path through the chaos. Hale followed, his own weapon barking as he moved. Whatever she was doing, whatever this really was, he wasn't letting her do it alone. They reached the central structure as enemy fighters converged from all sides. Evelyn kicked in a door and disappeared inside. Hale was 2 steps behind her, his heart pounding, his mind screaming that this was wrong, all of it was wrong. Inside she moved with absolute certainty, down a corridor, through a doorway, into a room that looked like nothing special, crates, old equipment, dust. But Evelyn went straight to a metal panel on the floor. She dropped to her knees, pulled a device from her vest, and began working with movements so fast they blurred. "Cross, what is this?" Hale demanded. She didn't look up. The real mission. The device in her hands emitted a soft tone. Green lights blinked in sequence. She pulled a hard drive from the floor panel and slotted it into her vest with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Package secured," she said into a calm channel Hale didn't recognize, requesting immediate extraction. And that's when he heard it, rotors, distant but closing fast. "Who the hell did you just call?" Hale asked, his voice low and dangerous. Evelyn finally looked at him. Her eyes were calm, steady, unapologetic. "The people who sent me here," she said. "Not your command, mine." The helicopter wasn't coming for them. It was coming for her. How do you process betrayal when bullets are still flying? The answer is simple. You don't. You survive first. You process later. Sergeant Mark Hale stood in that dusty room, weapon half raised, staring at a woman who had just rewritten everything he thought he knew about this mission. Outside, his team was pinned down, wounded, fighting for their lives, and the person who'd led them into this nightmare had just called for her own private ride home. "You used us," he said. The words came out flat, empty, like he was stating a fact about the weather. "Yes," Evelyn replied, no hesitation, no apology. "My men are dying out there." "I know." The rotors were louder now, close, the sound of salvation that wasn't meant for him. Hale's finger tightened on the trigger, not enough to fire, just enough to feel the weight of the choice. He could end this, right here, right now, one round, one problem solved. But Evelyn didn't flinch, didn't beg. She just held his gaze with that same infuriating calm. "You can shoot me," she said quietly, "or you can help me get your team out of here alive. Your call, Sergeant." The building shook as another explosion rocked the compound. Debris rained from the ceiling. Someone outside screamed for a medic. The sounds of men fighting, bleeding, dying. Hale lowered his weapon. "If we make it out of this," he said, his voice cold as winter, "you and I are going to have a conversation." "Fair enough." They moved back through the corridor together, Evelyn leading the way with the same unsettling competence she'd shown since entering the compound. She wasn't running. She was navigating, like she'd planned every step. When they burst back into the courtyard, the scene was worse than Hale had imagined. 2 men down, the rest pinned behind inadequate cover, enemy fire coming from elevated positions they couldn't effectively counter. The team's sniper was trying to even the odds, but for every hostile he dropped, 2 more appeared. The helicopter descended into the chaos like a bird of prey, massive and black, running lights off, door guns blazing. But this wasn't a standard Black Hawk. The markings were minimal. The crew wore gear Hale didn't recognize. And when the side door opened, the operators who emerged moved with a precision that made even his elite team look like weekend warriors. They hit the ground and immediately began laying down suppressive fire with weapons that sounded wrong. Heavier, more controlled, more lethal. Within seconds, they'd established a perimeter that pushed the enemy back like a tide retreating. One of them, face obscured by night vision and tactical gear, moved directly to Evelyn. "Commander," he said, not a question, a statement of rank. "Commander." The word hit Hale like a physical blow. "Package Lazarus is secure," Evelyn said, her voice shifting into something harder, more authoritative. "Enemy fire suppression and immediate extraction. Full team." The operator nodded and began issuing orders in hand signals so fast Hale could barely track them. The other operators moved like extensions of a single consciousness, covering fire, smoke deployment, wounded prioritization. In 30 seconds, they'd organized what Hale's team had been trying to do for 10 minutes. "Move," Evelyn shouted, her voice carrying command without effort. "Extraction point now." The operators fanned out, laying down precise covering fire that shredded enemy positions before they could react. Their coordination was flawless, economical, terrifying. Hale remained frozen for one critical moment. The woman he'd dismissed, the liability he'd minimized, the analyst he'd told to stay back. She was the mission. "Sir," the comm specialist yelled, grabbing his arm. The word snapped him back. "Move," Hale roared. "By pairs, go." The team broke cover and sprinted across the courtyard, rounds cracking inches from their feet. One man went down hard, leg buckling under a hit that dropped him instantly. "I'm hit," he shouted, panic rising. Before Hale could react, Evelyn broke from cover. She crossed open ground under fire, reached the wounded soldier, and hauled him up with a strength that surprised everyone watching. Bullets sparked off stone around them as she dragged him toward the helicopter, jaw set, eyes forward. "I've got you," she said, calm as a promise. Hale fired until his rifle clicked empty, then grabbed another weapon from the ground and kept shooting. He didn't question why he was following her lead. He just did. They loaded the wounded aboard as the helicopter strained against the weight of fire. The lead operator shouted to the pilot, 30 seconds. A voice came from inside the building. "Man down, east corner." Without a word, Evelyn turned back. She met Hale's eyes across the courtyard, just for a second. In that glance was something final, something undeniable. She wasn't asking, she was deciding. She and the lead operator sprinted back into the building, moving like mirror images, covering each other with lethal precision. The seconds stretched. Enemy fire intensified, desperation bleeding into every shot. Then they reappeared, half carrying the missing soldier between them. "Go," Evelyn shouted as they shoved him aboard. The helicopter lifted hard, banking sharply as countermeasures flared outward in brilliant arcs. Missiles lost lock and spiraled harmlessly into the dark. As the aircraft pulled away, Hale collapsed against the interior wall, chest heaving, mind reeling. Across from him, Evelyn Cross stood braced against the frame, already transmitting data through a secure console mounted inside the cabin. The analyst persona was gone completely. What remained was command. Hale watched her, the truth settling like weight on his shoulders. The helicopter hadn't come for them. It had come for her. But she'd brought them all home anyway. What do you say to someone who saved your life after lying to your face? The helicopter leveled out as it tore through the night sky, leaving the village and the men who would never know how close they'd come behind. Inside the cabin, the noise was deafening. Wind howled through the open door. Rotors thundered overhead. Medics worked with clipped urgency over the wounded. Yet amid the chaos, there was a strange pocket of stillness where Sergeant Mark Hale sat, his back against the bulkhead, rifle resting uselessly across his knees. Across from him, Evelyn Cross stood at a secure console, her fingers moving with calm precision as encrypted data streamed off the device she'd carried into the field unnoticed. Coordinates, names, signal maps, pieces of a machine that had nearly crushed them and would now be dismantled piece by piece. Hale watched her for a long moment before finally speaking. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice stripped of rank and edge. Just a man asking a question he should have asked days ago. The lead operator stepped between them, not aggressively but deliberately. "Commander Evelyn Cross," he said, "Naval Intelligence, Ghost Division." The words landed heavier than any round. "Commander." Hale exhaled slowly, nodding once as the truth aligned with everything he'd witnessed. So this whole mission was never about reconnaissance, he said. No, the operator replied. Your team was the misdirection. She was the objective. Evelyn turned from the console then, meeting Hale's eyes without challenge or apology. Your presence made my cover believable, she said evenly. Your skepticism kept attention where it belonged, on you, not on me. Hale swallowed. I treated you like you didn't belong there. Yes, she replied, and that's why it worked. The helicopter lurched as warning tones flared. A missile lock chirped, sharp and urgent. Without missing a beat, Evelyn keyed a sequence into the system. Countermeasures active, she said. Deploy. Flares blossomed in the darkness like falling stars. The warning tone died. Clear, the pilot called. Only then did Hale fully understand the scale of what had happened. This wasn't just an extraction. It was the closing move in a much larger game, one where his team had been pawns. Necessary, expendable, except she hadn't let them be expended. Hours later, on a different strip of concrete under floodlights, medical teams rushed the wounded away. The adrenaline faded, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Hale stood off to the side as personnel moved around him, his world quieter now, heavier. Evelyn approached him before disappearing into another briefing, another secure room he would never enter. Your team will be debriefed separately, she said. Standard protocol. Will they know, Hale asked, what this was really about? She shook her head, only what they need to. He nodded, then hesitated. You came back for one of my men, you didn't have to. For the first time, something softened in her expression, not weakness, but humanity. No, she said, I didn't have to, but that's not who I am. Hale straightened instinctively, something inside him recalibrating. Then for what it's worth, he said, I owe you an apology. No, Evelyn replied gently. You did exactly what I needed you to do. She paused, then added, just remember this next time someone tells you to stay out of the way. She was gone before he could answer. Official reports would later say that intelligence analyst Evelyn Cross was lost during extraction, presumed killed in action. Her name would not appear in press briefings. There would be no ceremony, no folded flag handed to a waiting family. Instead, Hale's team received quiet commendations, unnamed medals, lines in files few would ever read. Weeks later, Hale found an unmarked envelope waiting on his desk. Inside was a single line of text. Lazarus neutralized, 3 attacks prevented, 2,743 lives saved. No signature, none was needed. The number stayed with him, 2,743. People who would wake up tomorrow because of a mission that officially never happened, because of a woman who officially didn't exist. He kept the note in his vest pocket for the next 6 months, a reminder, not of deception, of purpose. Can respect exist without trust? Months passed, missions came and went. The rhythm of deployment became familiar again. Briefings, operations, extractions, the cycle that defined life at the edge of civilization. On another deployment, another analyst joined the unit. Quiet, awkward, asking questions that seemed out of place, the kind of person who didn't quite fit. The jokes started immediately. The smirks, the dismissive glances, the same patterns that had played out with Evelyn Cross. This time, Hale shut it down before it could take root. Enough, he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority he rarely needed to invoke. We make space. We listen. The room went quiet. One of the younger operators looked confused. Why, he asked. Hale met his eyes. Because you never know who someone really is until it matters. He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. The tone said everything. The new analyst, a young woman who looked barely old enough to be out of college, glanced up from her tablet with something like gratitude. But Hale wasn't doing it for thanks. He was doing it because he'd learned something in that Afghan compound, something that had cost him nothing and changed everything. Judgment comes easy, understanding takes work. Months later, on a different airfield in a different country, Hale saw her again. Evelyn Cross, this time in full uniform, rank unmistakable on her shoulders. She was walking with a group of senior officers, deep in conversation, her presence commanding in a way that needed no announcement. Their eyes met across the tarmac, just for a moment. She nodded, brief, professional, an acknowledgement between people who shared a truth that would never be spoken aloud. He nodded back. No words were exchanged. None were needed. In that silent recognition was everything that mattered. Respect, not built on trust but on something deeper, on the understanding that strength doesn't always announce itself, that competence doesn't need validation, that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should listen to most carefully. Hale turned and walked back to his unit, feeling something settle that had been restless for months. The anger was gone. The sense of betrayal had faded into something more complex, more honest. She had used them, that was true. She had also saved them, that was equally true. And in the space between those truths lived a lesson he would carry for the rest of his career. Later that week, he found himself training a new batch of operators fresh from stateside. Young, eager, convinced they knew what combat looked like because they'd excelled in simulations. One of them asked him about leadership, about how to know who to trust in the field. Hale thought for a long moment before answering. "Trust is important," he said finally, "but it's not everything. Sometimes you have to work with people you don't fully trust. Sometimes the mission requires it. What matters more than trust is clarity. Know what you're there to do, know your role, and when someone tells you to stay out of the way." He paused, a faint smile crossing his face. "Question it, respectfully, but question it." The young operator looked uncertain, "Even if they outrank you?" "Especially then," Hale replied, "because rank doesn't always mean wisdom, and sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the one who saves your life." He dismissed them and stood alone on the training ground, watching the sun set over distant mountains that looked peaceful from here. They always did. Weeks became months, months became a year. The rhythms of military life continued their inevitable march. Deployments, returns, briefings that blurred together, missions that became statistics in files no one would read. But some things stayed with you. The memory of rotors in the darkness, of a woman who moved like water through fire, of the realization that everything you thought you knew could be rewritten in an instant. Hale requested a transfer to a new unit, not because he wanted to leave, but because he wanted to lead differently, to build a team that didn't measure worth by appearances, that didn't dismiss intelligence because it came from unexpected sources. On his first day with the new unit, he gathered them for a briefing, looked at each face, saw the same mixture of confidence and uncertainty he'd seen in every team he'd ever led. "We're going to do things differently here," he said. "If you have information that could save lives, I don't care if you're a general or a private. You speak up. If you see something wrong with the plan, you say so. And if someone joins this unit who doesn't fit your idea of what a soldier looks like, you give them the same respect you'd give anyone else. Because competence doesn't have a uniform, and you never know who the person sitting quietly in the back of the room really is." They didn't fully understand. Not yet, but they would. Combat had a way of teaching lessons that briefings never could. That night Hale sat alone in his quarters, a half-written letter on the desk before him. He'd started it 6 times, never finished, never sent. "Commander Cross asterisk. You probably won't remember me. Just another sergeant in a long line of people who underestimated you. But I wanted you to know that what happened in Afghanistan changed how I lead, how I see people, how I think about judgment and worth. You saved my team, not because you had to, but because of who you are. That matters more than you know." He stared at the words for a long time, then carefully folded the paper and placed it in his desk drawer. Some things didn't need to be sent. They just needed to be written, to be acknowledged. The truth was simple. Respect often came too late, but it still mattered. Because it changed what came next. What does dignity look like when no one's watching? The question had haunted Hale for months, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he'd seen it lived out in ways that made him question everything he thought he understood about strength. 2 years after Afghanistan, he found himself in a briefing room in Washington, a room where decisions were made that rippled across oceans and mountains into places where people bled. He'd been called in as a subject matter expert. His experience, his perspective, the kind of consultation that felt more like theater than substance. The room was full of uniforms with more stars than he could count, civilian contractors in expensive suits, intelligence analysts who looked exactly like Evelyn Cross had pretended to look, uncertain, out of place, trying too hard to belong. The briefing was about operational security, about protecting assets in hostile territory, about the balance between intelligence gathering and force protection. He listened for 30 minutes before he realized what was missing. No one was talking about the people on the ground, the soldiers who would execute whatever plan got approved in this air-conditioned room, the ones who would bleed if someone made the wrong call. Hale raised his hand. A colonel he didn't recognize nodded at him. "Permission to speak, sir." "Go ahead, Sergeant." "With respect," Hale said carefully, "this entire discussion assumes perfect information, clean execution, cooperative terrain. But that's not what war looks like. The people you're sending into these situations don't have the luxury of certainty. They need to know that the intelligence they're acting on is worth their lives. And right now, I'm not hearing anything that tells me we've learned from past failures." The room went quiet, not hostile, just surprised, like they'd forgotten someone from the operational side was present. A woman at the far end of the table spoke up. "What would you suggest, Sergeant?" He looked at her, saw the rank on her shoulders, saw something familiar in her eyes. "I'd suggest we stop treating ground teams like chess pieces and start treating them like the experts they are. Include them in planning. Listen when they raise concerns. And for God's sake, stop sending people into situations where the intelligence is questionable just because someone in this room wants a particular outcome." The silence stretched. He expected pushback, expected to be dismissed. Instead, the woman at the end of the table smiled faintly. "Noted," she said. "Thank you for your honesty." The briefing continued, but Hale noticed something shift. Questions became sharper. Assumptions were challenged. The conversation became less about what they wanted to happen and more about what could realistically be achieved. After it ended, he gathered his materials and prepared to leave. The woman from the end of the table approached him. "Sergeant Hale," she said, "a moment." Up close, he could see the insignia, naval intelligence, senior rank, and something else. Something in the way she carried herself that reminded him of someone he'd met in a dusty compound half a world away. "You knew Commander Cross," she said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am. She speaks highly of you." Hale blinked. "Ma'am. She said you were one of the few people who learned from Afghanistan, who took the lesson and applied it rather than burying it in anger." He didn't know how to respond to that. The woman handed him a card, plain, no agency markings, just a name and a number. "If you ever want to do work that matters," she said, "where your experience could shape how we operate rather than just executing someone else's plans, call that number." She walked away before he could answer. Hale looked at the card for a long time, then carefully placed it in his wallet, next to the note about 2,743 lives saved. That evening, he sat in a hotel room overlooking the monuments that marked power and sacrifice in equal measure. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Heard you made quite an impression today, still asking the hard questions. EC. He stared at the message, then typed a reply. Someone taught me that assumptions get people killed. Figured I should return the favor. The response came quickly. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The words hit him like a memory made solid. The moral she'd lived out in that compound. The principle that had saved his team. Thank you, he typed, for everything you didn't have to do. You're welcome for everything you did afterward. The conversation ended there, but something settled in Hale that had been unsettled for years. A sense of purpose that went beyond following orders, beyond executing missions, beyond surviving. He thought about the young analysts who would join units like his, the ones who would be dismissed, underestimated, told to stay out of the way. And he thought about the sergeants like him, who would have the choice to either perpetuate that cycle or break it. The next morning he made a call, not to the number on the card, not yet, but to his command, requesting a new assignment, training, development, a role where he could shape how the next generation thought about leadership, about judgment, about the quiet competence that saved lives. 3 months later, he stood in front of a classroom full of young officers, beginning their journey toward positions of command. Let me tell you about a mission in Afghanistan, he said, about a woman everyone dismissed, about assumptions that almost got good people killed, and about the lesson that changed how I see leadership. They leaned forward, ready to hear a story about heroics, about combat, about glory. What they got instead was truth. She was told to stay out of the way, he began, to stay quiet, to let the professionals handle it, and she did, right up until the moment our lives depended on her doing the opposite. He told them about Evelyn Cross, not the commander, not the operative, just the analyst who everyone underestimated, who absorbed their skepticism, who used their dismissal to accomplish a mission that saved thousands of lives. And then he told them what mattered most. When the helicopter came, she could have left us, he said. The mission was complete, the objective secured. We were just the cover story, but she didn't leave. She came back, under fire, for people who had treated her like she didn't belong. The room was silent. That, Hale said quietly, is what leadership looks like. Not the kind that announces itself, not the kind that demands respect, the kind that earns it through action, through sacrifice, through choosing to do what's right even when no one's watching, even when no one will ever know. A hand went up, a young lieutenant. Sir, how do we develop that kind of character? Hale smiled. By remembering that dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. By understanding that strength isn't always loud, and by treating every person you meet, regardless of rank or role, as if they might be the one who saves your life when it matters most. The lesson ended. The students filed out, but Hale knew that some of them would carry those words forward, would lead differently, would create space for the quiet competence that changed everything. Years later, he would receive reports, stories from former students, about analysts they'd listened to, about unconventional perspectives that had prevented disasters, about judgment withheld long enough to see the truth beneath the surface. And each time, he would think of a dusty compound in Afghanistan, of rotors in the darkness, of a woman who had every reason to leave and every excuse to let them fall, but didn't. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.